I'm Gary DeMar. Welcome to Vantage Point. In this session, we're going to be talking with Wes Moore, and we're going to be discussing the 7 laws of apologetics.
Vantage Point is brought to you by American Vision. For more about the topic of today's show, check out Thinking Straight in a Crooked World. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.
Wes, welcome back, and we're continuing our talk on apologetics. And the time we talked before, where we did our Worldview Conference, you had talked about the 7 laws of apologetics, which we couldn't get to because of time constraints. And first of all, define for us what is apologetics, and why is it necessary, and how is apologetics somewhat different from arguing?
Right.
Because people say, oh, we shouldn't be arguing with people. Well, really, in biblical terms, we shouldn't be involved in being argumentative.
Right.
But the idea of arguing and evaluating things from a critical perspective is something that is legitimate. So tell us a little bit about what apologetics is all about.
Apologetics is from a Greek word apologia, and it means to defend. So anytime you take a position on something, a baseball player, baseball team, whatever it is, you have to defend that. Somebody's going to disagree, somebody's going to point out weaknesses, and so you try and defend that. So apologetics is a word, what we try and say is giving answers. It's giving answers for what you believe. Why do you believe what you believe? And why is it that someone else's belief isn't valid or isn't right? So that's what apologetics is, and it really serves 2 purposes. The first purpose is to solidify your own faith. I've heard from many Christians over the years, and they say, I wasn't sure about the Bible. I believed in Jesus. I went to church, but it wasn't until I really got into reading the good books by, Sproul. You talked about Ligonier Ministries, Sproul, and other people like that. They say, well, this really solidified my faith. Yeah,
in fact, there have been people who have attempted to debunk the Christian faith, who, in attempting to do that, have come back as believers.
Lee Strobel is a great example.
Yeah, Lee Strobel, and I think Lew Wallace, who wrote Ben-Hur, and I'm just trying to think of the other fellow, the fellow who wrote, I think it was Who Moved the Stone. There have been a number of people out there who have attempted to refute the Christian faith. When they actually go and they look at things, they say, "Wow, I really never saw that." Part of it is, Jesus deals with this on the Sermon on the Mount. I call it the "you've heard it said" principle. A lot of people will say, "Well, the Bible teaches this," and I said, "Well, maybe you've heard the Bible teaches that, but that's not in the Bible at all."
Yeah. That's one of the 7 laws.
Yeah. Okay. So let's
talk about that. So to solidify the faith of the believer, this is very important for the youth. Extremely important for the youth, that they are taught continually not only a biblical truth, but also a defense of that truth against other worldviews that they'll come in contact with. And that's one of the reasons we're losing so many of them. But the other is to remove barriers to the cross. So if the average unbeliever today could name 4 or 5 Bible difficulties off the top of their head, all right, they have been trained from the time they were born that Christianity is not true, the Bible's not true, there are many ways to God, all these different things. And so to go on and assume that the average lost person doesn't have any questions that you have to deal with is not going to be a successful strategy. So that's the role of apologetics. And apologetics is not arguing. And one of the laws, we'll get to the 7th law, is never get angry. That you are not in an argument as you think about a conflict. It's not a conflict. It is a discussion about ideas and trying to help people see.
Yeah, the Apostle Paul is a good example in Acts chapter 17. He gets up there and you don't see him blowing off steam or being argumentative. And it's a very civil exchange of ideas. Now, sometimes, as you know, the people you're arguing with and doing it in a biblical way, I mean, they get pretty teed off as a result of it.
And Christians get upset too. And most of the reason I think Christians get upset is because they are not certain about what they believe. And when they talk to an atheist or an unbeliever and that person gives them questions about their faith, they're going, I don't know. And their reaction is, you're just wrong and I believe.
Yeah, because a lot of times, I mean, I've talked a lot about unbelievers over time, and they are, you know, when the Bible talks about their hearts are darkened.
Oh, sure.
They suppress the truth in unrighteousness. I mean, there is an attempt. I remember one particular fellow that I've talked about who would send me dozens of emails a day. I've got at least 500 emails from this guy, and it didn't matter what I presented to him.
Sure.
And when I first started arguing with him, I laid out my case, you know, point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4. It didn't matter. When he made this statement that this fellow did in fact say this, and I went through and I found all of this information, wrote it kind of like a legal brief against this guy. It didn't matter. I know, said, I know he said it. So there are all different types out there that you have to deal with.
Yeah.
So let's go through the 7 laws.
Okay, the 7 laws. The first law is the other guy doesn't know as much as you think. In my experience, I have found that the average non-Christian is not a PhD level Richard Dawkins kind of person. What they know, what they've heard over the years. They repeat the lines, sort of the talking points that they hear in school and the media from their friends. So they don't know as much as you think. And the reason that that's a law, and that's the first law, is because many Christians are afraid to engage the lost because they're afraid what they know will be insufficient and the other person is just going to destroy them. And indeed, there are smart people out there, don't misunderstand, who are well-schooled.
Right, there are people who make it their business. I have a friend, James White, who deals with Muslims. He'll tell you that some of the guys he's debated have better understanding of the Christian faith than most Christians do. But that's a rarity, and that person has made it his task to take on the Christian worldview. And we have to admit it also as well. The average Jehovah's Witness that comes to your door knows generally more than Christians, and that's why a lot of Christians are sucked into it, because they know. That isn't the general guy that you meet at a bar somewhere,
or your neighbor, or the guy in the cubicle next to yours at work. Generally speaking, they only know their information 1 or at best 2 layers deep, and so if you become schooled 2 or 3 layers deep, which isn't that far, you can overcome their questions most of the time.
Okay, number 2.
Number 2, everybody has faith. Everybody has faith. This especially comes up when in the science realm. The scientists, the evolutionists, the atheists will say, you're all about religion and we're about science. You're about belief, we're about fact. But in fact, science itself has to make assumptions that are faith-based in order to do science at all, right? So we have to assume that there's a reality outside of us, but you can't prove that. You just have to assume it. You have to assume that the universe operates by regularities. You know, the laws of nature are the same in M51 as they are here and throughout all time.
You got to assume that reason is reasonable.
Right. And you can't prove it in a lab, so you have to take it by faith. And so when you can point that out, everybody has faith. You got to realize that we're all starting with presuppositions, starting assumptions, belief, and we're moving to the facts with that belief system. So that's the second one. Everybody has faith. The third, if I might, is a contradiction can never be true. Contradiction can never be true. It's amazing how little people in general know about basic thinking, basic common sense. This one comes into play a lot when you're dealing with the issue of all religions leading to the same God. That is something that the average non-Christian, every one of them, will repeat that like a parrot. Okay? But they never thought about what that really means. It means that a contradiction, 2 statements that are contradictory can be true. Because every religion, every other worldview contradicts with Christianity on all the basic points.
Right.
God's nature, Jesus' nature, the resurrection, the way of salvation, heaven and hell, they're all completely opposed to each other. So if I say we're all going to the same place, getting to the same God, that's essentially saying that a contradiction can be true. You can go north from Raleigh and get to D.C., and you can go south from Raleigh and get to D.C., but you can't. You end up Miami in one and D.C. in the other, and that's the third law. A contradiction can never be true.
Okay.
All right, keep going. Okay. The fourth is never say I don't know twice. One of your best friends as you engage the lost is a question you can't answer. When somebody brings up some issue, some nuance that you just don't know the answer to. Because what that gives you a chance to do is say, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that, but I'm confident there's a good answer. And so you go back and you research and you learn it, and you go back to your friend and you say, well, this is what I found out. And what it does is over time you build this little toolbox of answers. simple answers that you know, and then all of a sudden people aren't stumping you as much. And you find out that there are a common set of questions that come up.
And if you never go out and do this, you never get better at it.
That's right.
And I mean, that's, again, when I started in that place in Michigan, you know, sitting down with people, that's what I did. I went, I'm going to go read. I remember probably the first book I got was Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. It had a lot of good stuff in it.
Yeah.
But keep in mind, a lot of people who you do debate with will use a lot of these questions as diversions to get you off track.
Right.
And you say, you know, that is a really good question, and you might have an answer to it already. But you know, right now we're talking about this, and the cults are really good at that.
Oh, sure.
You bring up a particular Bible verse, and they say, "Well, what about this over here?" And you're tempted to go and go there. You say, "No, let's stick with this. Let's stick with who Jesus is." So the next one.
So verify everything. Verify everything. What I've learned is, it goes back to the first point, the other guy doesn't know what he's talking about usually. So if a person makes a statement and they make a claim and they say, John said so-and-so, or Darwin did this, or whatever, verify that. Don't accept it and try and argue from it. Go and verify it. It's also true of Christian arguments. If a Christian gives you some kind of an argument, you know, Darwin repented on his deathbed, you know, or something like that, I've learned...
Which he didn't, by the way. He
didn't. I've learned is that you've got to say, okay, I'm going to go verify that before I accept it or argue.
I always say for them to verify it, instead of me doing the work of verification. You know, when they say something, I say, can you give me the proof of this?
Well, that's the sixth law.
Okay, so we only have another minute, so
he gave these to me before we started. Very good. Yeah, you've got to have proof.
Yeah.
Right. You've got to have proof. You can't just claim something. You've got to know why it's true. And so what you said is just so wonderful. When someone says, like I had a lady on an airplane once said, God is the divine feminine. And I said, what's your proof of that? Why do you believe that? What is the proof of that? I don't really have any proof.
And you're back to one. Yeah. Back to, is it number?
Yeah, the other guy doesn't know what everybody has faith.
Right. Everybody has faith in something.
And you can demonstrate. And so what I've seen people do over time is they will change their mind while you're talking to them because they realize their thinking is so wrong.
Yeah, and a lot of people, because we live in this kind of politically correct and very diverse type culture and all that, they're generally not challenged on those. Boy, that's really. I remember a Rockford file where Jim Rockford is sitting across from this woman who believed in Eastern stuff, and she says, "Oh, you know, it's like the sound of one hand clapping." And well, Rockford now we're getting back to the last one here. You know,
you gotta have proof.
Never get angry.
I'll never get angry. Yeah, that's the last one.
And so James Garner reaches across the table and slaps her across the face, and he said, "That's the sound of one hand clapping." So, anyway,
that's great. Yeah. So, never get angry is the last one. Other people will get mad. You can't get mad. You can't lose your head. You've got to keep it. And if you're confident in what you believe, there's no reason to be angry.
Well, Wes, again, it's Evidence America.
It's America.org.
And we're going to come back. We'll be one more session with Wes on his novel, The Maker.
Thank you.
For more related to today's show, check out the highly rated title, Thinking Straight in a Crooked World, by best-selling author Gary DeMar, president of American Vision. Gary DeMar shows the power of biblical thinking and the desperate need for it in the church today. Thinking Straight in a Crooked World is designed to identify the bends in the road of ideas and repair them with biblical straight thinking, from worldview to apologetics. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.
I still don't believe Gary could lift all that weight in his office. He said he could. Maybe later he'll have to show me if he can.
Before the year's out, I'm hoping